All right. On this first Sunday of Lent, allow me to open our time together in prayer. Will you all please join me in prayer? Loving God, way maker, we offer you a prayer of thanksgiving for our time together tonight, for the gift of Dr. Dan Hale, and for all of the energy that engages us with our topic tonight, mental health. We praise you for all the ways that you have equipped us, the opportunity to gather via Zoom, the gift of Dan Hale's book that we could read to prepare us for this conversation, small groups, and his very presence tonight. We pray that we may, through this gathering, come to understand far better the interconnectedness of mind and body and spirit, and the way that we can support one another through all things. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, welcome everybody. We're so glad everybody who's been able to make it is here with us. Today would have been Dr. Hale's daughter, Libby's 45th birthday. And when I asked Dr. Hale to be our speaker, he responded by saying that this date, today, would be especially meaningful for him. Thanks for being here, Dr. Hale, at this time, and we welcome you in this place at this special time. And this speaks volumes about his journey through difficulties and complexities of depression. I met Dr. Hale one evening at a forum put on by Johns Hopkins. We got to talking after the program, and his passion for impacting people with mental health challenges, directly and indirectly, through his own experience as a sufferer, practitioner, and parent of a child with depression came through loud and clear to me. He also has a passion for how the church can be involved. Not only has he seen this disease inside out, he has gone on to share his personal story, his daughter's story, and spent time talking with churches, one being Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, where coincidentally Jacob has also served. And he has spoken with bishops and priests in the Episcopal Dioceses of Newark and given workshops for laity in various churches. Dr. Hale grew up in Orlando, Florida. His family was active in the Baptist Church. He has a major in social work from Florida State and a minor in psychology and religion. He considered going to seminary, but he went on to get a master's at Emory and a PhD at UMass at Amherst. He's been a psychologist at Orlando Medical Center and a professor at Stetson University. In '92, he began his work on building medical religious partnerships. Currently the special advisor in the office of the president of Johns Hopkins Bayview Medical Center, he has also served as a professor of medicine in geriatric medicine and gerontology, and assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He's devoted much of his research and his clinical work to mood disorders. He received medical and psychological treatment for his own depression. And he's decided to use his own dark moment of losing his daughter, Libby, by suicide to shed light on this crippling and often deadly disease. He is the father of 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and is currently a member of Brown Memorial Park Avenue Presbyterian Church in Baltimore, Maryland, near where I grew up. His latest endeavor, I hope he'll tell us about, is developing a congregational depression awareness program, training his first 2 cohorts. You know, my own bipolar diagnosis came after decades of suffering, and in secret and behind closed doors. And when our daughter's roommate took her own life her senior year, and our son's wife's sister took her own life, I knew that it was time for me to start talking too about depression. Talking more in our schools, more in our churches, more in our neighborhoods. And so, Dr. Hale, with your long interest in the intersection of faith and health, I am thrilled to welcome you tonight and to have you share your story, your expertise, and your hope for the future. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to come tonight. I'm very honored, and thank you for the kind words. And you opened with something very important, obviously. 45 years ago, my wife and I welcomed Libby, our beautiful daughter, into this world. But about 8 years ago, she took her own life. And at her memorial service, those of you who read the book know that people said, you know, well, my other 2 children said, Dad, you really need to talk openly about what killed her. She died of cancer. We'd talk about that. And so I did. And so many people at that service, memorial service, there were almost 400, you know, said, we're so glad you spoke about this. We should talk about it more. And so that's really been much of what I've done the last 8 years. And tonight, I thought I would just sort of share my journey through depression from several different perspectives. So as Amy said, in college, I was a social work major, actually gone to college as a business major. Lost interest in that pretty quickly. And thought at first the church would be where I would go. Visited several seminaries, including 2 Presbyterian ones, Louisville and Union. And but decided that really I felt much more drawn to working with those who are experiencing mental illness. So when I started my graduate training, although I knew I wanted to work in the mental health field, I didn't have any specific disorder or condition that I felt I was drawn to. So I was sort of free to learn about all of those. And I found myself drawn to depression. And often people say, is that because you had it in your family, or have been depressed? And the answer is, I had never been depressed at that point. And as far as I knew, no one in my family had. Looking back now, it's a good chance that that's not the case, that in fact, we did have family members. So that's sort of where I went. And I think there are 3 aspects of depression that really drew me in. One is just, I was amazed at how this condition could transform people. People who had been confident, successful, highly regarded, respected, loved, had sort of everything available to them. And they had instead they had lost all those things. They lost confidence. They no longer felt worthwhile. They felt worthless, in fact, and loveless. And it was just such a tremendous transformation to see someone who had been successful and then ended up seriously depressed. So that was the first thing. I was just intrigued. How can this happen? How can people sort of lose all that confidence that they had before? And the second was, as I learned more about it and realized, as Amy certainly noted, it's a killer. You know, people die of depression. The latest figures just came out from 2019 are that more than 47,000 people die by suicide every year in this country. And we know that that's a low estimate. And let's feature one thing in particular, which is that many of the opioid deaths are very likely suicides. And I say that because what studies show this, but often when someone dies of an overdose, they list the cause as undetermined or accidental. If you do psychological autopsies, you find that many of those are actually suicides. So I'm sure it's well over 50,000 a year die by this disorder. But the third was that I saw people that I just mentioned how transformed they've been. I've seen them recover from depression and to come back able to love life and love people and love themselves, and to be able as a psychologist to play a role in that was just so gratifying. So those are the things that really sort of kept me focused on depression, although I had opportunities to work with other conditions as well. So I finished graduate school. We moved back to Florida. I worked at Orlando Regional Medical Center for a while as a psychologist, but knew I really wanted to make sure I had an academic career as well. And so in 1979, I was able to take a tenure track position at Stetson University in Florida. It's on the sort of between Orlando and Daytona Beach. Lovely campus, lovely student body, colleagues. It was just ideal in many respects. And so life seemed to be on track for me. Most of my life, it seemed to be on track. Minor detours, but always upward and onward, feeling very successful. And I was a very confident person. And by 1988, 9 years after I went there, I was a tenured professor. I had been publishing a good bit. I had my own clinical practice as well. And life was very good until things began to come apart. And so what I meant is that actually my parents had retired to the same community. My father became seriously ill and died. My mother died about a year later. And then it was only a few months after that that I realized my marriage was dying as well. So there were these three losses that came on together and were just so devastating. And it was obviously a very stressful period in my life, taking on new responsibilities and these major changes. And so, and I think this is an important point. So the first part of this period here was one I would describe as very, very stressful. And I'm distinguishing that from depression because, some of the stress was, I had to work many long hours. I had to put in hours in evenings and weekends, and I had to learn new things, how to handle estates and, all these legal matters and so forth. So yes, it disrupted my sleep. I was tired much of the time. But during that period, initially, I still had the capacity to, when there was a break in the schedule, I could enjoy things. I could enjoy certain activities. I could enjoy being with people. I was still optimistic. I figured I would gotten through everything else. I would get through this. And I still thought of myself as a pretty good person. Somewhere I lost those three things. And that was a sort of insidious slide into depression. And in spite of my training and my experience, I actually didn't realize I had slid across that line into depression. It may sound strange, but believe me, it can happen. And in fact, it was a conversation with a former student of mine who was off in graduate school, and she'd been one of my best students. She occasionally babysat for the children. And we were talking one day, and she said, "Dr. Hale, I think you might be depressed. Maybe you should talk to someone." And it hit me. She was exactly right. What I was describing was classic depression, all the symptoms that we associate with it. So that I was feeling hopeless. There was nothing I could enjoy, nothing I could enjoy. It didn't matter if I had a break from the stress, I couldn't enjoy it. And I no longer liked myself. I was to to see myself as a weak person, unable to cope, that was very tough. I hadn't been there before. So although my training and experience couldn't protect me from depression, it did at least inform what I should do. And so I went to my primary care provider, who knew me fairly well, and he prescribed an antidepressant medication, and that seemed to stabilize me or made me steadier. I guess I should sort of talk about some of the symptoms, what it was like. I mentioned some of them, but for my depression, this first episode, one was, yes, I had a depressed mood. And part of that was, I just felt numb at times. I just felt empty and numb. The second part that I sort of hit on, I lost the ability to enjoy things I used to be able to enjoy before. And it's not just, I no longer felt like playing volleyball with my friends or playing with my kids. It was like I couldn't find any joy in life at all. I remember in graduate school, there was this, so graduate school for me was obviously a long time ago, but what struck me back then was there was this phrase that was used to describe depression. One of the features was loss of the mirth response. And I realized that really hit me because I could hear a joke and know up here that was funny. I could, see a comic scene and know that was funny. I could see my child do something spectacular and know that was great, but I couldn't feel it. That's what I mean with that loss of capacity to enjoy anything. Sleep was terrible for me. I had trouble going to sleep. I had trouble staying asleep. So instead of being able to, put down the book, turn off television, go to sleep, I would lie awake. Much of that time with these terrible, terrible thoughts rolling through my head. What a bad person I was, what a terrible situation I was in, and how hopeless life would be. And these things would just roll through. I could not get them out of my head. And then, I would finally fall asleep, but it was generally the hour about 4:30, about 2 hours before I typically like to get up. I would wake up and just lie in the dark, feeling so alone and isolated. I was exhausted all the time, easily fatigued, things that I previously could do effortlessly. I just couldn't handle. They were overwhelming. I know that I was slowed down physically. I was slowed down mentally. I had a lot of trouble concentrating. If I tried to read a book, I couldn't do more than a paragraph or two. If people were telling me something, I often couldn't stay focused long enough. I lost weight because food no longer was appetizing. I didn't have the energy to, fix a good meal for myself, or I didn't want to go out and run into people. So I quickly lost 10 or 12 pounds. I mentioned sort of the problem with concentrating. Two other symptoms. One was just how worthless I felt. I felt like a fraud. I felt like an imposter. I felt that I would be discovered by students and colleagues as unworthy of being a professor. I even thought at times that I should just go ahead and resign. And the other one was, although I was never suicidal, I'm just fortunate that I wasn't, but I was convinced that I would not lead a long life. I did not expect to see my children make it to adulthood, which was only more depressing. And I was thinking as I was preparing for tonight, to clarify how helpless I felt. I had started doing some work with older adults, and here I was, 38 years old. I was working with those well into their 70s and 80s, many of them living in an assisted living facility. And I can remember thinking, this is where I should be, because I don't feel like I can handle even just the basics of getting along. So those were the symptoms that just had pulled me down so much. So as I said, I went to my primary care provider who prescribed an antidepressant that worked. It sort of gave me a sense of being steady and less fragile. It didn't really sort of make me happy. Antidepressants are not happy pills. I knew that, but it did sort of put a floor under my emotions. But that only did so much. And I'm grateful for the medications. Again, I'm a psychologist, so I don't prescribe medications, but I believe in them. And then I went to see a psychologist that was very good. And just, part of the magic of psychotherapy is, for those 50, 60 minutes, I had his undivided attention. He was focused in on me. He listened, he understood. He could hear how I had so distorted myself, my views of myself and my world of the future. And he had sort of brought me back to reality gradually. So I think probably we would talk about this more sort of a cognitive or cognitive behavioral therapy. So I came back. I recovered from that depression. It took a while, but I didn't resign. I didn't lose my position. And I think the question that has come up often, especially speaking in faith communities, what role did my faith have at that time? So I'll be honest, there was no scripture that I can recall really speaking to me in those dark moments. There were sermons, I can't recall any detail, sermons and often music that touched me. But the way that my faith impacted my depression in a helpful way was members of the church who, when they saw I was hurting, and they knew that I no longer had my parents around to help care for me. My only sibling lived 500 miles away. And, I was no longer married and going through this tough time. They reached out with tremendous love and support. The term I'd heard ever since I was a child was the idea of a church family, and that really meant something. This was my family during this period, and they carried me with their love and concern. Now, I have to say, I think that being a Christian, and part of that being a Christian was an obligation I had felt from childhood to be a good person. That was just sort of wrapped up in who I was and what my family was about, to be just a good person. So in some ways that made it more difficult when I was depressed, because I felt like I was no longer that person that I had thought I should be as a Christian. So on balance, certainly I'm grateful for the love and of my faith in my church family. But I just think it's important to also realize, that can be a little bit of a negative there too. So anyhow, I bounced back, and life was very good. A number of years later, I met a wonderful woman, and Kim, and we married, and children continue to grow and have their own successes. Libby was a spectacular swimmer, and in the swimming world, if any of you have children, or if you were involved in swimming in your life, you know that there's some really objective measures there. I mean, if you're talking about baseball, you could say, well, my kid hit 5 home runs, and you don't know whether the fences were 100 feet away or 300 feet away and so forth, or what the pitching was like. But in swimming, it's the same pool length every time, stopwatches and so forth. So Libby was the fastest 10-year-old swimmer in the country in 1986. My 2 other children had their own areas of success. And so it was a good period. And I thought life was just great. I published a couple books that had been well received, and won some honors. And then 2005 came, and I was down in that depression again. And it was a very scary time. I don't think I mentioned that with the first one. I mean, to be depressed can be frightening. Just not knowing, what's coming. If you've hit the bottom, and maybe you're going to bounce up, or if there's still farther to go. And so I had the full complement of symptoms again. I think I was actually a little more frightened. I know that this was a period where I really, really dreaded going into the classroom. I just felt that I would be discovered and I would just be terrible. But it was also a time when my family rallied around me. My wife never made me feel guilty about the things that she had to take over from me. She insisted that I still have some activity. She nudged me gently but firmly to not drop all the things that I enjoyed doing, that we enjoyed doing together. And I went back to my primary care physician, but he actually was out of the country on an extended vacation. And I went to see the person that he was covering for him. So when I had my first episode, Prozac and the SSRIs were just coming on the scene. And so I used an older generation, first generation antidepressants. It was, by the time in 2005, the second generation, the SSRIs were very common. And the physician prescribed one of those new ones for me. It did not go well. It actually didn't do anything for my depression. It increased my anxiety. He tried another one. It didn't work well. And that's when I picked up the phone, or my wife picked up the phone and talked to one of my colleagues up here at Johns Hopkins, and said, Rick, Dan is in bad shape. We need to get him some help. And so there were a couple options there, and I'll go ahead and mention one I didn't choose, but I was ready to do, and I would have done it had the other option worked. I was ready to get on the plane and come up to Hopkins and check myself in, because I was just scared. I was so far down and I was scared. And that was an option that was there, and I was ready for it. But he found a psychiatrist a couple hours away from me in Florida. I went to see her. She did a very good job of assessing it and prescribed another antidepressant that just really, really helped. Just sort of smoothed out the rough edges, helped me sleep again, which was so important. If I can get a good night's sleep, I can sort of handle a lot of the daily stresses. And I went back to see my psychotherapist. So I came out of that. And then there was a decision to make. And the decision was, did I stay on the antidepressant medication, or how long would I stay on it? And I bring this up because I know, and I felt it myself, I knew not to give into it, but I hear it a lot. A lot of people say they judge their success in how fast they can get off their medication. And that's just not the best way to approach it. So we know that depression, that after all your symptoms have remitted, you no longer have those depressive symptoms, it's a good idea to stay on at least 6-9 months, some would say 12 months, because it reduces your risk of another episode. And depression, as with the other mood disorders, are episodic conditions. In other words, they're periods of episodes with symptom-free periods in between. And so, knowing that, and knowing that this is my second episode, I actually made the decision to continue taking the medication. So this is, 15 years later or so, and I'm still taking the medication. So I say that because I'm not ashamed of it. I think, it's a smart thing to do, at least for me. So that's sort of along the lines here, 1992, as Amy mentioned, I began working with these two geriatricians at Johns Hopkins, one of whom was active at Brown Memorial Park Avenue. So that's sort of how I got introduced to that church. Even before I moved here, when I visit Baltimore, I would attend there. And what we had, the way we approached this was that if you look at the what's going to impact healthcare. So this back in the 90s, right towards the end of the 20th century, we knew that there was going to be a bulge in the population sort of statistics, the demographics for older adults, that by 2020 or 2030, at least 1 out of 5 older adults would be 65 or over. And we know that with an increasing aging population, you have an increase in chronic diseases. It's hard to make it to 65 without at least one chronic condition. And when you look at chronic conditions, you realize how much responsibility rests with individuals and their families. And so that's where we said, well, maybe we could start partnering with churches so that, we could provide the education they need and support they need so that they could reduce their risk of heart disease or cancer, or if they have these conditions, they could manage them better. So that's how I really got that going in that area. So the work was much, we published a book in 2000 called Building Healthy Communities Through Medical Religious Partnerships. And then in 2009, we published the second edition. By that point, my colleague, Dr. Bennett, had become president of Johns Hopkins Bayview. And we did a symposium up here, and people said, you're doing all this great work in Florida, why don't you come up to Baltimore? And so my wife and I moved from Florida to Baltimore, have loved every minute here. So moved up here in 2011. The one thing that I was really concerned about at that time was my daughter, Libby. She had had some very tough periods. Starting with her teenage years, she had some depression. And she went from being this confident, she was introverted always, but still very popular, respected, loved, to really losing her drive. She pretty much gave up swimming. She ended up having some experimenting with drugs to her detriment. She was pregnant when she was 15, decided to marry and have a child. And that marriage fell apart, but she had later had another marriage that fell apart with these two tough times. But then she had really sort of stabilized, and she felt very confident that she was on the right path. She was living with a former friend, and they had sort of it seemed like they had a good, stable setting. So when the offer came, she really, said, Dad, please go, I'll be fine. So it's a decision, of course, that I always have to look back at, just to be honest, because came up here and had a great first year, and was just getting ready for my second year in September of 2012, when I got the call that she had been hospitalized involuntarily because of a suicide attempt. And she was released, and before we could make other arrangements, she made another attempt that was so seriously damaged to her lungs, we were very doubtful she could ever recover. So she spent 4 months in an ICU unit, and then passed away in January of 2013. So I can talk, I'm sure we're gonna have time for questions. I think that's the format. And I'm fine delving into any of these areas. But it was part of the, I'd heard so often when I did talks on depression before my child had that, the frustration of other parents who are, how do you help a child? And it's so challenging. And so then I was beginning to live it myself. And I sort of, told you that when she died, Libby's sister and brother, Graham and Will, who were devastated by this, but really convinced that, and I think I'm glad that their generation is more open, saying, Dad, you got to be open about this. Too often people are suffering in silence, and they don't recognize it. And I think those are we have good treatments for depression. Sometimes for some depressions, it's tough to find the right one, but we have good treatments. But we know that about a third to a half of people who suffer from depression don't get the treatment, do not get the right treatment. And why is that? And so one of the reasons they felt, and I felt, was there's a stigma there. People still are embarrassed or ashamed to say, I suffer from depression or bipolar disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder, and instead they try to hide it. And so they don't get the sources of support they could get. They don't get the professional care that they need. And so, Dad, speak up on this. So I did. And like I said, we gave my daughter, Libby, had always enjoyed going on a summer trip. She hadn't been on a lot, but a mission trip to Nicaragua. And so we offered, this funeral arrangement, memorial service arrangements was done in a week. And so we said, in lieu of flowers, if you'd like, you can contribute to the mission trip, or to a yet undefined depression education program. And so it was a Friday night service. On Monday morning, Libby's mother, who's a school teacher, had a fellow school teacher come in and give her a check for $1,500 and said, you have got to do this depression education program. And so over the next few weeks, people contributed $20,000 to create this. So we knew we were tapping into something really important there. And so that's when I've always enjoyed doing educational talks in the community and churches, but this was like, we've got to do more of this. We created a video. We were persuaded to Libby's story could help others. And so it really does focus on her. It's called We Need to Talk, a story of loss and hope. It's available on YouTube out there. And so the things just sort of kept rolling along. So I'm going to try and sort of get to a point to welcome questions here. But what I found was the more I talked about it, the more encouraged I was. And one of the things that people said was important was to share my experience. And I'm not the type of person that feels like I have to be out in front doing things. But if that's helpful, then I'm willing to do it. And so that's what I have been doing. And that led to a decision or a question. Should we develop a program specifically for faith communities? There's a program that got started here called the Adolescent Depression Awareness Program, which Dr. Karen Swartz, it's been a great program, and they go into schools. And they've got really 2 or 3 objectives there. One is to say, make sure people understand that depression is a medical condition. It is not a sign of failure or weakness. It is a medical condition. And this is how you can recognize it. And this is where you can turn for help. And so we thought, could we do the same in faith communities? And it actually sort of goes back, we've mentioned Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York. It was actually there that I was giving a talk on depression one time when a person from another foundation heard and said, we think we might want to help you on that. And so we put together this program. We just trained our first 2 cohorts. And one of the things I'm proudest about, because yes, there's a lot of stigma in society still. And I think in many churches, there's still considerable stigma. I've also heard, and I think it's true, that the amount of stigma is even, the level of stigma is even greater in African-American churches. And so what I'm so pleased about is that of the 19 people who went through our course, 18 were African-American. And I just heard from one of them today saying, you know, so much we're taught to just pray about it. You know, just, you know, to have greater faith. And this is what we need. So this is what I've been working on, and it's sort of, I think, going to consume much of my career over the next few years. So I can go in any direction here. And I don't know if there've been some questions, or Jacob or Amy, if you think that there's certain things you know about. I know one of the questions that you gave me in advance was about new treatments. I don't know if we want to do that now.
Yes, please. That would be great. There already are a few folks who have added questions into the chat. And so I would invite anyone who is attending to please, that is the location to put them. Please open your chat box, type them in there. They will get to me, and then I will pass them on to Dr. Hale. But yes, that actually is one that's already been posted in the chat, and one that we did send to you is about types of treatments that are not necessarily medication. Could you share some insight on that, please?
Yeah. So let me, if I don't mind, expand it a little bit. So certainly,
Please.
so I think people are, so psychotherapy, which we've already talked about, psychotherapy has been found to be effective for mild to moderate depression, and often is an adjunct for moderate to severe depression with medications. So today, if you find that you need treatment, I often suggest you start with your primary care physician, who's probably going to feel capable, competent of choosing among maybe 3 or 4 antidepressants that they feel comfortable with. And may refer you for psychotherapy. If those medications don't work, or they're worried about you're suicidal, or the depth of depression, they may go ahead and refer you to a psychiatrist. But so antidepressants tend to be you know, the sort of front line, and I think people hear a lot about them on, you know, the ads. And so you hear about Zoloft and Cymbalta and these medications. Generally, they're either what we call selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. And so they work for about 60 to 70% of people. So you get a good response, maybe 60 to 70% of the people. They give some help to others, but there are other people who are seriously depressed, and the medication, traditional antidepressant medications don't seem to touch it. And so we call this treatment-resistant depression. So if someone sort of had 2 full courses of antidepressant medication, the right dosage and the right duration of time, and they're still depressed, we'd say that could qualify as treatment-resistant depression. So what do you do with it? So one, I'm actually going to start with an old treatment that is overlooked sometimes, or people fear. So I'm going to get to the new ones, the very newest ones, but that's ECT. ECT stands for electroconvulsive therapy. It's somewhat of a misnomer because there is no longer a convulsion that goes along with the treatment. Now, if you like the films from the earlier years, from the 70s or so, there was a film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Won the Academy Award. Jack Nicholson won the award, and in it, he receives ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, and there was a violent convulsion. And during that period of the 50s and 60s, sometimes those convulsions were so drastic that bones would be broken. So it's probably not an fully inaccurate portrayal, but that's not how ECT is today. So ECT today is done generally in the hospital. I said it's a misnomer because there's no convulsion. You're given an anesthesia. You're given a mild muscle relaxant, and you're getting these very brief electrical impulses. And for people who have not had any relief from depression, this seems to work about 50%, 50 to 60% of the time. And I bring that up because if I were to fall into a serious depression again and medication, psychotherapy didn't work, I would myself go for ECT. So I want to dispel some of the old images of it. The more, I think, more encouraging or less threatening, one you might have heard of repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS or RTMS. And I have not had this treatment myself, but I have witnessed and talked to seen it administered and watched it. And what it is, well, it looks like you sort of have your own, like a cap, and then a helmet sort of comes over you. And it's about a 20-minute treatment. And during this time, powerful electromagnets are activated. So there's nothing intruding on you. And somehow that seems to, we believe, increase the amount of neurotransmitters in the brain, much as the antidepressants do. So it's painless. You do get a headache, they say, but you can be reading a book, listening to music, playing a game on your phone while you have these sessions. A third approach to the treatment-resistant depression is ketamine or esketamine. So it is a medication, but I think it is one of the, I know I get this question a lot. So ketamine, which was actually a major tranquilizer, but they found that it also can have antidepressant effects. So ketamine is done by infusion. So it has to be done in an office. And one of the problems with antidepressant medications is if they do work, they generally take 4, 6, or 8 weeks to have the impact. So there's just some delay there. Ketamine seems to, I mean, we know, has a more immediate effect. And so, you know, people can feel their mood rising very quickly. So I mentioned ketamine is infusion. Esketamine, ketamine, is done by nasal spray. It has to be done in a clinic. They will not give the medication to you, a patient, but they will give it to the clinic. At the clinic, you will go in twice a week for a month and then once a week for the next second month. They check your blood pressure because it could drive up your blood pressure, make sure it's not high. It's simply, you know, nasal spray, either 2 or 3 dosages of that. Talked just a few weeks ago to a woman who had never gotten any relief from depression until esketamine, and just, you know, said it's just been a lifesaver for her. You know, she'd been so hopeless. So it's still, because the good results were so good, they sort of allowed it to be used early. But that's why you have to go into the clinic. You have to stay there for 2 hours after you've had the treatment. Can't drive that day. So a lot of precautions. Now, I don't know if anyone was thinking, but I guess I should go ahead and mention a fourth one, which is not available to the general public as treatment, but it's gotten a lot of news. 60 Minutes did a special on it. And there's a book that talks about it a lot, and that's the use of psilocybin for mushrooms. And and that research is actually being done right here on the campus of Johns Hopkins Bayview, out here in East Baltimore. Dr. Randall Griffiths, a very distinguished, very conservative psychiatrist, but became fascinated by it. And it's it's just being studied right now, but the initial results are very encouraging. It's probably not going to be available in the next 5 years, but maybe 10 years from now, something it would be. So So there are some hopeful signs. And if you're interested in that, Michael Pollan wrote a book called How to Change Your Mind, and does a very good job describing that. So I hope that those are some of the encouraging, but again, and I do not want to overlook psychotherapy. I mean, the results are good. It's not, there's evidence, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, and interpersonal therapy are two approaches that are well documented to be helpful. So let me pause there.
Dr. Hale, thank you so much. And while you get a drink, let me also give kudos to the folks who are attending, because we have so many questions and the quality is incredibly high. So let me just continue to thank everyone here in attendance tonight. We'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. There is a question about insurance. And for folks who might not have as many resources as others, where could someone go for help if they don't have a primary care physician, or if they have fewer resources or don't necessarily have insurance? What are some of those other insurance challenges that folks that suffer from this may face?
Yeah, and so to broaden my answer a little bit beyond that, even if you have insurance today, it can be hard to find a provider. That's something we're really up against right now. And just to throw one little statistic in there, if you look at the number of people reporting symptoms of depression, it's about 3 or 4 times what it was a year ago. And so the rates of depression and anxiety have gone up tremendously. The emergency lines are overwhelmed with calls. So even if you have insurance, it's hard to get the provider. Every community is supposed to have, thanks to some federal funding passing down to the state, a community mental health center or community mental health service, some form of service there. So that would be the best way. And usually you can find that through United Way 211 is always a good option. There are organizations that can help you too. The Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, which is an advocacy group, but also tries to provide support groups and access to services. Your Mental Health Association might be able to help you, and National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI. So those are 3, people associated with those 3 organizations are pretty savvy about how to find the care. I would also say that I'm proud that in Maryland, we have something called the Pro Bono Counseling Project, and there are more than 800 licensed psychotherapists who have pledged to take at least one non-paying patient. And so that's a wonderful resource. I wish other communities would do that. And I think there are therapists in every community who, if somebody would help organize that, would be willing to do it. Some of us always did sliding scales or took some pro bono cases, but it's nice to have an organization that can facilitate that.
Thank you very much. The issue of employers and a lack of understanding with this is a huge problem. Yeah. Could you speak a bit about what needs to be done in that area? Do you have any recommendations?
So I'm glad that a lot of organizations, some of the large ones, but even some smaller ones, have EAPs, employee assistance programs. And often those are a good place not only to turn for sort of crisis counseling and a referral on, but some of them, certainly the ones, some around here, also strongly advocate for greater awareness. I think that, what I hear is, the personal examples when people will speak up, people who have been successful, who are recognized as, capable individuals, and talk about their experience with depression or bipolar disorder, and how with care, with treatment, they're able to come back, fully recovered. And that we, that we shouldn't be ashamed. And I realize I have a lot of flexibility here. The man who hired me here is the one who helped me find a psychiatrist. But that's a vote of confidence, not simply in me, but in treatment. So I just think we've got to speak up more and more, and we are seeing, whether it's athletes, entertainers, some business executives sharing that. I think that's a great way to do it. It's good, but we got a long way to go. A long way to go.
We have a question that says, thank you so much for sharing your story and in doing so, helping so many others. What is your experience or your view on supportive modalities such as meditation or breath practices or somatic practices that can be tremendously empowering at times?
Yeah, so, the one I'm most familiar with, so I'll limit myself to that, is mindfulness. Mindfulness, or it's very similar to meditation, or has been shown to be effective for a lot of mental health conditions, or as part of the overall treatment. So I'm very much a believer in mindfulness or meditation, or there are relaxation exercises. So I think when you talk about care, and I often overlook this, there's medication, the strictly medical approach. There's the psychological approach, and there's self-care. So I think that to learn those things, and that's a great question. Yes, can mindfulness help? Yes, can it get you over serious depression? Probably could be a good part of the overall care. But I also believe that to get back into the routine, whether it's, if you used to exercise, at least go around the block once, even when you don't feel like it. This is part of the trick on when you're depressed, is you keep saying, I know I should do that. As soon as I feel better, I'll do it. And you've got to flip that around. You've got to say, I don't feel like doing this, but in my moments of clarity, I know that if I do it, I'm going to feel better at the end of that. And so I think whether it's meditation or other, and support groups, and just getting back in the routine, eating well, trying to get to sleep, so forth. If you find that, humorous movies are good, or if you find that stories of people are uplifting, whatever can work. But I would say do more than just medications and psychotherapy.
So this question approaches this from a different lens, and that is, what would characterize a loving outreach to someone who is in the throes of depression? What sort of outreach, even while offered in the spirit of care, is not helpful? How can we sort of best gauge that? Yeah,
so I think, that what is not helpful, I'll start with that. Because and often the unhelpful people are so well-intentioned. And so, when they hear something about how you're feeling, how you're depressed, how you're hopeless, before they even hear you out completely, they want to jump in with reassurance. You're going to be fine. Think about how fortunate you are. Think of all the people in Texas who don't have power. Think of the people over, another country where they've had earthquakes. You've got it so good. That's just not helpful. So it starts with listening patiently and carefully, to let them tell you that, and convey to them, you want to understand. I want to understand what you're going through. Maybe I'm having trouble, but I really want to understand what you're going through. And then not to offer, quick reassurance, but to say things like, I'm very concerned about you. I care about you. I love you. And, I understand, I think I understand that it's probably going to take some time, but, I think, that there's a good chance that, you can recover from this. And I want to walk beside you during this period. I'm not your therapist, but I want to be there. So I want to call you just to check in And the depressed person often says, you don't need to do that. Partly, I think, because depressed people don't feel worthy of someone else's attention and time. And to say, I know I don't need to have to. I do it because I want to. And I want to come by. You know, we don't have to do anything. You don't have to entertain me. I'm just going to stop by and see you. So that's sort of, you know, through words and actions conveying that I care about you. I love you. I want to be a part of your support system. You know, I'm going to stop by on the way to the grocery store, the drugstore, and, you know, won't you just go with me, you know, just 15 minutes, or can't we walk down the block? Those are the sort of expressions that we hear as being helpful. So.
Thank you very much. This approaches this again from sort of a different standpoint, but could you talk a little bit, please, about postpartum depression and how approaches to combating that are similar or are different to more generalized depression?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on that, so I'm going to lead by saying that. But I also want to, you know, make it clear that postpartum depression is real and is potentially life-threatening, not only to the adult, but to the child. I'd say this, I received a letter from a woman in jail, in prison here in Maryland. She had read an article that I wrote in the paper, and she shared her story, and I actually went to visit her. And I know this is hard for a lot of people to take, but I believe her. You know, during her postpartum depression, her view of the world was so bleak, was so dark, that she felt the only way that she and her child could be together forever would be for both of them, for her to take her own life and the child's life. The child died and she did not. And of course she was convicted and is in prison. But I mean, I think that we have to recognize, yes, there are the blues that go with childbirth sometimes, but there's also very severe depression that can be along with that. So we need to take it seriously. You don't just assume, well, yeah, you'll get through it. It's a time for help. I'm sorry I can't offer more, but.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. There is a, there is a question that asks, are there groups for people who have lost immediate family members due to suicide? And and if there are, do you think that they are helpful? Question from the chat.
So yes, there are. I don't know if every community has these. In Baltimore, we have SOS, which is Survivors of Suicide. It actually got started at an Episcopal church, Church of the Redeemer, up on North Charles Street, Amy. So I'm sure you know that. And Reverend David Ware is the pastor and priest there.
That's where I was married.
Oh, okay. Beautiful, wonderful church. Where one of the priests actually now has a mental health first aid course. I should mention that too.
We have that in Alexandria too.
Wonderful, wonderful. But yes, so the SOS, and it's one that I went to for a few times after Libby died. And yes, I'm glad they have it. It was helpful. I went, and there is, you know, when we talk about survivors of suicide, there are those who, you know, make an attempt on their own life and survive. But we also talk about survivors of suicide being those who lost a loved one. And yes, those support groups are available in some communities, and I think they play a very important role.
You know, a good source for that as well is that there are death, dying, and bereavement organizations that offer a variety of groups, and they do have groups for survivors of suicide as well.
Well, that's good to know. Well, good. Glad to learn.
Going back to the postpartum depression question, someone asks, can fathers have postpartum depression?
I've not, it's hard to answer. So I think it can be a difficult time. And of course, you're talking more psychological rather than where you've got more going on with the mother. But can it be a difficult time and, a difficult enough time that you should reach out for help? Yes. But
as a father of a daughter who died by suicide, what can she share with us to do and say when signs are being manifested for possible suicide? So what can Libby share for us? What can she teach us?
yeah, okay. Hold on, I lost my screen here for a second. Gotta get it back. It times out here.
We still see you great. At least I do.
See me trying to remember my password. But, yeah. So I think, so let me say suicide in general, and then I'll bring it more to Libby. So when we look at suicides, in most cases, the vast majority of cases, there is an underlying mental illness. And the most common one being major depression or other mood disorders, also alcoholism and substance use. So, you generally talk about an underlying condition, and then you talk about current stresses, which could be bullying, could be losses, and so forth. I think that, looking at Libby, she began to lose interest in things. And so, she had always been a good student, not a brilliant student, but a good student. She had always had friends. She had always been an athletics superstar. And, what we saw was beginning, and what she was saying, or what should have been communicated is, she was losing that ability to enjoy anything, and to find any direction, any hope. And then the self-criticism really came in. Those are the things that I think we really need to look for. And it can be difficult with a teenager, it's a moody period, you would say. But, when they've turned away from so much of what they used to do before, when you see the grades falling, when you see them losing interest in the activities that their classmates have, and when they begin to withdraw. And it can be also, when they start lashing out. So, any of those. And, it's depression at any age represents a change from a prior level. So if you know the baseline, what's changed about it. So Libby was always an introvert. Her sister was always an extrovert. So, if her sister were to sort of become really introverted, I'd get very worried about that. So again, it's looking for that change in mood, change in interest. So that's the best approach, is to be looking for that. And then to try and stay open and in touch as best you can. Making it clear, you're not judging them, you just really want to understand what they're going through and how you can help them.
So we have this question that is very poignant for our gathering tonight, and that is, what are some recommendations that you can give us that churches can do based on your many avenues to helping in this field? How can churches best be engaged to make a positive difference?
Yeah, I love to speak on that. And so, if the 3 or 4 barriers that I generally put up there in terms of people getting the help they need. So one is they don't even recognize what they're going through. And remember, I failed to recognize that for a while. I see Amy pointing to herself. So one, to be able to recognize it. And so you need to educate. And so, what your church is doing is fantastic. It's exactly what needs to be done. The second is you need to destigmatize it. And how do you do that? And of course, since she spoke earlier about her own condition, I will point, when Amy and I were sitting together at this conference in, Washington, she said, I'm bipolar. And I said, well, I'm unipolar. And, neither of us were ashamed to be talking about it. So I think to have individuals, to speak openly about it. And when and part of that is that, someone like myself or like Amy, we're not ashamed of it. And we're also evidence that, you can come back from it, or you can manage it and still have a good life. The third is, to get some resources. And, that's one of the real challenges here, is that we've already talked about that. So I think that churches that can have their own resource, I mean, you've already heard Amy suggest some things I didn't know about, and maybe I've suggested some things you all haven't heard about before. To know those agencies that I mentioned, NAMI, Mental Health Association, Mental Health America, Depression Bipolar Alliance, to do a mental health first aid course, all of those things. And, you can build on the national campaigns. So May is Mental Health Month. October is, Depression Awareness Month. But I think you just have to keep putting it out there. And I am absolutely convinced there is a real hunger for this information. People just want to know about what it is and, what can be done about it.
I do think too that there are ramifications to speaking out. We can't be put your head in the cloud. I mean, when I tell certain people about my bipolar, still to this day, people sort of go like this and, they back up and they're not quite sure they want to, they don't know what to think, because there are a lot of people out there who don't know very much about, OCD and bipolar and some of these things. So you have to be willing to, when you do put yourself out, like you have, Dan, and others, that there are consequences, and, and choose to do it anyway. And yet, if you choose not to share the information, that's okay.
Absolutely. I'm glad you make that point, because like I'm in an enviable position in this sense, and at my age, and with the full support of my boss, I can do it. I realize that many people cannot do that, which I think puts even more of a responsibility for those of us that can to do it. But yeah, I would always say, be very careful about being that open. But those of us who can do it, I think we should. And the program NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, has an In Our Own Voice. So they have speakers that will come out and talk. So there are people who have already taken that step and received some training on how to give presentations. And in churches, so there are 3 books I recommend. One is, if you don't really understand depression, but you really want to get on the inside of it, William Styron's book, Darkness Visible, is fantastic. It actually started with a lecture he gave here at Hopkins a number of years before he died, of course, and just 85 pages. But if you want to understand bipolar disorder, An Unquiet Mind by Kay Redfield Jamison, who is a psychologist who herself is bipolar, has bipolar illness, and happens to be at Hopkins. And the third is by an Episcopal priest, Barbara Crafton, called Jesus Wept. And it's a very confessional, very first person account. So I think that, to do another book club down the road with, one of those books. I think the book club idea is a great way to go. That way you don't have to say, well, I'm going because I'm depressed, or I'm bipolar, or I'm OCD. You're going because you want to understand and you're really curious. And here's a book we can sort of learn from.
Well, Dr. Hale, this has been amazing. I am so grateful for you being with us tonight. And before we conclude, I'd just like to offer you the chance to, if there's anything else that you'd like to share with us before we conclude. And to, again, we had amazing questions. We did our best to get to as many of them as we could. Thank you to everyone who's in attendance. And thank you to you, Dr. Hale.
Well, I'd just say, the invitation that came was such a great invitation, and I really, feel privileged to have this opportunity. I saw we were, running 60 to 70 people here tonight, but on Sunday evening, that many people would come. I'm just very impressed. Like I said, I think this is a very important topic. I think it's the time for the church to be as open as we can about other conditions. And I think what you're doing is great. And I look forward to post-COVID coming down there and visiting sometime. Alexandria is a great little town to spend a weekend.
We look so forward to hosting you in person, and it's been great to have you here in the virtual space. And Dr. Hale, thank you so much. I invite all of us to give him a virtual round of applause. This has been illuminating. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for your courage and for your incredible witness. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.